everybody. Welcome back to another conversation on the Art of Coaching podcast. I am here with Kim Scott. Kim, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, listen, I love having conversations with people who are real, who are candid, and who have a mutual distaste for leadership-based fluff. I also have a strong love for people that are into improv and role-playing and know that that's really kind of the quintessential aspect of life. So I'm going to start with an easy question here before we get into the meat. You know, you do some work with Second City, the renowned improv association. How in the hell does that have anything to do with your work as in the leadership space and everything else?
Absolutely. So it all started with a podcast, like so many good things. So shortly after Radical Candor came out, Kelly Leonard from Second City called me up and we had this great conversation. And as I was working on with a bunch of different organizations, my team and I have helped teams put the ideas in Radical Candor into practice. And the thing that was needed was practice. But people don't really like role plays per se. And so I was sort of trying to experiment with what's a better way to build these skills, which are so important for work to be successful and enjoyable. And I was talking to Kelly about it, and he's like, that's what improv is.
Yeah.
And in fact, I started working with this team, and we were talking about radical candor and obnoxious aggression and ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity. And they were like, this is an improv exercise. And so we started working in that way. And then I wrote my next book, Just Work. And we've done a bunch of work also sort of helping people disaggregate bias, prejudice, and bullying, which I think we often conflate like they're one thing, but they're actually three different things. And the responses to each have got to be very different. And yet these are the things we hate. We pretend like they don't exist. At least I did for too much of my, it's hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I was sort of in denial about this stuff. And by using improv, we're able to practice different kinds of responses. Let's see if we can come up with something that works better.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot of touch points there. And we're going to go into some of those revelations that you learned between book one, book two, and everything in a moment. But sticking on what you said about role playing and improv and really just different forms of scenario planning. You know, we had a professor from Stanford come on that teaches improv and champions that as well. And I remember even when we were trying to put that into action in our audience, that's the first response you get, right? Like you said, oh, role playing improv. And you have to first say, yo, first off, this isn't all just like jokes. Like life is improv. Yeah. You and I, right? This isn't some scripted, oh, look at all my notes. And me and Kim, like question one and then question two. And I think there's also this reality, although I'd love for you to, whether you agree or disagree, share your thoughts. Books are just not enough for people to be able to adapt their behavior, no matter how well written, and yours are exceptional. But do you feel like books, you know, we live in this period of books and TED Talks, and these things are great. They introduce you to ideas, but can we really get better at anything that you talk about without practicing in real time?
Unfortunately, this is hard for a writer, and I do consider myself now a full-time writer. It's hard for a writer to admit, but books rarely change behavior. You know, one of the things that I learned since Radical Candor came out is I thought when I wrote the book that I had broken it down into all the smallest parts so that people would be able to so-called roll their own. You know, you could read the book and figure out how to roll this out on your team. And I realized that, you know, often I had said in the book something analogous to make a peanut butter sandwich. And what I needed to say was open the refrigerator, get out the peanut butter, open the drawer, get out the knife, you know.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. And so, you know, I thought when I wrote the book that it was sort of, that the book was the last mile to the listener's ear. But it turned out it wasn't. That's why I built a company around Radical Candor and another company around Just Work. Folks really want help putting these ideas into practice.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's a huge part of them even taking accountability. I remember, sad as it sounds, even when I speak now, I have to do an entire slide on how to set expectations. Yeah. Right. I was recently speaking, I had like 50 minutes, which sounds like a lot, but as you know, when you're getting into complex topics of human interaction, it's not. And I have to say, remember, like, this is a snapshot, please avoid sending a tweet saying this is an absolute belief or this and that. And then also remember, we want to teach you how to think, not what to think. Even if we did spoon feed you, or like what you said with the peanut butter, you still got to swallow on your own.
Yeah.
So looking into that, one soundbite that I had heard from a previous interview that I loved, and I know it was tongue in cheek, so I'll hedge that, is you had said, in a sense, my whole career was a ploy to subsidize my novel writing habits. Now,
not tongue in cheek. That was quite literal.
Oh, perfect. All right. Well, just, and I like it. You're just matter of fact. What I loved about that in particular is real life offers the best content. And this is why your books are outstanding. And when you write what you know, that whole literary axiom, it's going to be more well received. So now let's talk about this revelation you had between book one, Radical Candor, which, talked about, to say it's about feedback is serving it not at all, right? But this was a book about being upfront, knowing how to really get to the core of what matters to folks. But then all of a sudden now, like going into just work is about, as you mentioned, how do we address bias? How do we address bullying and do those things in a non-soft, folksy way so that people actually take accountability? How do you bridge this gulf? What was that revelation where you realized book one wasn't maybe enough?
Yeah, so radical candor, be a kick-ass boss without losing your humanity. That's what radical candor, and the part of radical candor that most resonated with folks who read it was the part about feedback. And if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And so shortly after the book came out, I was in San Francisco giving a talk at a tech company, and the CEO of that company is someone who I like and respect enormously. She had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, and she's also one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And when I finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to put it into practice than it is for you." And she explained to me that when she offered someone even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I had 4 revelations at the same time. The first one was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagine myself to be, that I want to be. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly pleasant and cheerful at every meeting we had ever been in together. And believe me, she had what to be pissed off about from time to time, as we all do at work, but she was not allowed to show it. It was not safe for her to show it. The second thing that I realized from her words was that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that had happened to me as a woman in the workplace. Hard, again, for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit I was in denial, but I never wanted to think of myself as a victim.
Yeah.
Even less, though, than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I ever want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And yet now I had to come to grips with the fact that I had caused harm. I hadn't meaned to, but I had meant to, but I had caused harm to people who I cared about in the course of my career. And the fourth thing that I realized was that I, as a leader, had failed to create the kind of environments in which everyone can just work, just in the justice sense of the word, but also in the just get shit done sense of the word. And that was what really prompted me to write my next book, Just Work.
Well, I'm glad you went with that story, because we were having a conversation as a staff when we were researching your work, doing more reading of it. We all read it. We have great contributors, because we wanted both male, female, wide-ranging kind of aspect of like, how are we interpreting Kim's work, right? So we can bring honor to it in that way. And here's something, and this is going to be this is more of an honest inquiry. So forgive me if it seems like a weird question or not phrased perfectly. This is something that I think is tremendously difficult for me to talk about, even founding my own company, because if I didn't say, "Hey, Kim, I relate to that story so much." One, I feel like I'm wrong saying that because I am not a Black woman, right? Yeah. But if I'm trying to say just nuts and bolts without hey, I oftentimes have to control my responses to things, because I'm a male, I'm 5'8", I'm fairly stocky, I have a beard. And somebody asked me at a recent conference, "How do you avoid getting labeled as the angry white male?" And I want to ask some questions, but then I don't want to get, I know one time we were about to go into that territory. Then somebody says, oh, well, because you think that you're a male, you don't have it as bad as other people. Now all of a sudden becomes a suffering Olympics, and we don't make anything productive happen. So sometimes I find that now I shut my own questions down of how can I even one, express myself honestly, which I need to be able to do sometimes. I know your book gives great tools, but two, how do I avoid asking questions without getting compared to other folks from other backgrounds, identified genders, nationalities, and where do we kind of keep the discourse, positive or constructive rather than just getting into this mishmash of how, who has it worse and how do we do this and how do we do that's one thing that's always sticky for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, there's another story in the book about my husband who's a white man, and he was in a meeting at a tech company, and the marketing executive, who's a woman, had named her marketing campaign Rolling Thunder. Oh, and he knew that if she knew the history of Rolling Thunder, she would never have invoked that in naming her marketing campaign. And yet he was reluctant to say anything because he didn't want to get accused of mansplaining or being an asshole. And my husband is not an asshole. He's a great guy. And so I understood his perspective, but it also, it sort of pains me because I knew her as well, and I knew she would have wanted to know. And so I think there is an element of self-censorship that people are undergoing. And, I struggled with this a little bit as I was writing Just Work, because I'm like, do I have a right to talk about injustice? I mean, if anything, I've gotten more than my fair share of the good things that life has to offer. And so I haven't experienced injustice. I've just experienced, a surfeit of.
Sure.
And so if things have been unfair, they've been unfairly good to me, not unfairly bad. And so I think, as when I started the company Just Work, I started it with Trier Bryant, and she says all the time, this is not a competition of suffering.
I'm glad she said that. Yeah.
She says that all the time. And I think it's really important. I think it's also really important to realize that, yes, you might say the wrong thing. In fact, it's not might. You will say.
You will.
I will say the wrong thing. We are all bound to mess up. And if we're so conservative that we're unwilling to risk messing up, we're not going to fix anything. We're not going to enjoy working together. And so I think that part of what I wanted to do in writing that book is to help create an environment in which we all extend ourselves and others a little bit of grace. Yeah. And that we hold each other, that we're radically candid about this stuff. We hold each other accountable. We're open to receiving the feedback. We're open to giving the feedback. And that we, it's one thing to apply a growth mindset to math. I'm getting better in math. It's much harder to apply a growth mindset to these issues of, I don't want to harm someone. I don't want to be biased. I don't want to be prejudiced. I don't want to bully people, but I do all these things. And when I receive feedback that I've done something or said something that is biased, prejudiced, or bullying, it often feels like a condemnation of me as a human being, but It's not. It's like, if I want to become the person I want to be, then I got to listen to this feedback. Just like if I want to be a better writer, I have to work with editors who are going to tell me when I could say things better. So that's kind of the goal.
You touch on that perfectly. And I think, the reason it will resonate with our audience is especially even though our work now spans coaches in a wide range of whether it's tech and medicine and military, I started off in sports performance and the sporting world. And there you have a lot of coaches that are going to be unapologetic. This is who I am. This is how it is. And if anything, they've ran away from any book that tells them to, think about that. I mean, even when we started a company based on human interaction, there was a coach that said, oh, I communicate every day. Why would I need a book that teaches me how to do it? And the bad joke I use is, well, I wake up a husband every day. It doesn't mean I shouldn't work on my marriage.
Yeah.
And so you being able to say, yeah, this isn't about a competition of suffering. This is about just being more mindful about the words that come out of your mouth. Then I think that you do a good job too in just work and your other work in general of saying that, like, listen, there's onus both ways. I love this one quote that, the most important thing in communication is to hear what isn't being said. And that was like an old Peter Druckerism. And that coincides with something you said in your book, Just Work. You can't be great at your job if you can't be who you are at your job. Now, that goes both ways. Yeah. You don't just get to be you without boundaries, you without a sense of moral duty, you in these things. But at the same time, you can't just abide by ceaseless self-censorship, because then it's like saying nobody should have to intuit, to read between the lines. We should have a society where there's no grace. Are there any thoughts on that in general, or am I interpreting that incorrectly?
Yeah, no, I think you're interpreting it right. I would just add that I think sometimes people will say, I'm going to be my authentic self. And they what they mean is, I don't have to pay attention to how my words land for other people. And of course, that's not.
Yeah, that's wrong.
Part of being your authentic self is caring about figuring out how to find a way to communicate with this other person. I had a boss one time who said, all of us have red words. And so there are certain words which, if you say to me, I'm not going to hear another damn word out of your mouth, because you've just, and it's, if you and I are going to work well together, you're going to avoid those words. You're not going to call me honey bunch or something like that. Not that
right.
But whatever. I've worked with, look, babe, and you're not going to communicate well with me if you call me that. And I'm not saying nobody can use that word. I'm just saying you can't call me that.
No, keep going.
Yeah, and the person who said this, he had lived through the Holocaust in Europe, and is Jewish, and he was very focused on, like, there are certain words you just, and I'm going to be, because I care about mine, I'm going to care about yours, and we're going to try to, and it doesn't mean there's like that's not political correctness, that's like common human decency in my book.
Right. Well, and it comes back to this idea that, I don't know why people feel like communication, how we interact, that has literally led to wars, ended careers, all that is just something that people shouldn't have to think more deeply about. Yeah. And part of me feels like that's the bigger agenda that, like, people like us have to work towards, is helping people realize that, okay, gravity is invisible, but it has pretty dire consequences on the way that we live. Communication, how do you make communication cool? How do you make communication, which is this skill and this process, right? Let alone, and I know you give tactical tips in your book, and we're going to hit it, but just you and me talking as individuals here, how do you think we remarket the way people look at the process of shared meaning, shared respect, and common ground?
I think very often, I was talking to an engineer who I worked with about this, and he was sort of complaining that I was asking him to try to interpret other people's emotions. And I said, look, when you communicate with another person, you communicate with them at an intellectual level, yes, and you're also communicating on an emotional plane.
Yeah.
And if you pretend that emotional plane is not there, you're just not going to communicate very well. So, like, you could wish that we as human beings didn't have so many emotions. You can wish that all you want, but it's just reality. And so I think, one of the things that I have found is really helpful is when you're the speaker, own how it lands for the other person, even though you can't control that. And when you're the listener, try to own how it's landing for you, even though you can't control what's coming out of their mouth. And if both the speaker and the listener take full sort of responsibility for themselves and how it's impacting the other person, then maybe we'll communicate. But communication is a dialogue. It's not a monologue. And so we're stuck trying to figure out what's going on with this person who we're talking to.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. I think that, and I'm one of those people that I'm fine being wrong, but I do think that we'll continue to see an emergence in technology I know Amazon and other companies have done it, like trying to give us more information about how we're coming across. And that's a big part of like my PhD, is trying to create this evaluation that people can have in their hands. It's not dry, not sterile, not like the HR piece, but it says, hey, we know that perception is completely unique to that individual. And let's have a conversation. Kim, if you thought that you were a 3 on assertiveness here, and I thought you were a 1, and Rodrigo from Spain thought you were a 2, well, let's address that perceptual gap instead of sitting here saying, well, no, you should always talk like this, and then we should have a bunch of cardboard cutouts.
Yeah. Sort of like Textio. I'm curious. I'd love to know more about that, because it's something I've been thinking a lot about. Is, for example, one of the things I talk about in Just Work is, can you sort of create these interventions, for example, in performance reviews, where you're saying, oh, she's so abrasive, and like, could your performance review tool talk back at you and say, would you say the same thing about a man? Or, she's a real mother hen. These are all examples that come from real life. And could your tool talk back at you and say, would you say that of, would you call a man who's a leader who you admired, a real father rooster? Probably not.
Right. No, 100%. This is something we definitely need to, I want to get with you offline. We'll have to talk more about this, and leading off of those things. Another quote from your book, Just Work, that I appreciated is, often corporate feedback training will advise you to respond by saying, when you do X, it makes me feel Y.
Yeah.
But I don't recommend this approach for confronting bias at work. Now, I want to keep reading it, but I'd rather give you a chance to elaborate on it. Why don't you like that? And what is still failing in that kind of corporate feedback training environment to you?
Yeah, so I especially don't recommend it for bullying. And the reason is, so if you're confronting bias, I recommend an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, or whatever.
Benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. And then an I statement sort of invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. And that's a situation where when you do this, I feel that that sort of formulation might work. But if you're confronting bullying at work, that's not. And my daughter taught me this when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied, and I was recommending to her to say, when you blah, 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 I feel sad. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? That's a really good point, And so what we talked about is to say, you can't talk to me like that, or why are you talking to me like that, or what's going on for you today? So that she now was in the active stance. She wasn't submitting to whatever, she wasn't answering their questions. She was asking the questions.
Right.
And that kind of pushes the bully away a little bit, which is sort of what you want to do, I believe. I think a big problem with a lot of corporate training is that they identify one situation and then they apply something that might work in that situation to a whole bunch of situations where it's not going to work. They don't do improv, right?
Exactly. It's one size fits all, which, I mean, that is a huge thing that, that nearly cost me my life in the medical community. You see somebody, like, I was treated like a symptom instead of an individual. And you see this in workplaces as well, big and small. And in improv, that's the thing I was going to ask you. Is that something that, if you were to see this, and I know this could be hypothetical or you can lean on the experience, when you run something like that in improv, what might you expect to see? In terms of people having those discussions, it's hard enough to get people to go into, let's say it's you and me, Kim, let's have some fun. Okay. Let's say that, what role do you want to play? Carte blanche here.
I'm going to be the person who caused harm. I'm going to be the perpetrator.
Okay. Then I'll be the person that felt harm. Right? Is that accurate? We'll start with that. Okay, so I'm going to do it wrong at first. Listen, I don't really like the way that you talk to me. You talk down to me, and I feel like you're not recognizing my expertise, and I don't know why you want to bulldoze me like that.
I can tell that I have upset you in the way that I just said blah, 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 and I'm sorry. My goal is not to upset you, but I can also tell you really care about making this podcast better. And so I was trying to give you a little bit of a tip that might help. Would love to know how I could have said that better.
Yeah, I just think that, I'm already a little on edge because in in this company, I feel like I'm not given a lot of the same respect as everybody else. I'm kind of an outsider coming into this, and I'm trying my best to make things great. And it just feels like I have to prove myself to everybody. That's how it feels. And I was hoping with you, it would be a little bit different, but apparently it's not.
Yeah, well, I would like to make it different. I'm sorry, and I'd like to be more aware. And so I want you to know I'm wide open to hearing about it when I screw up, because it's not my intention. And I'm also don't want to put all the burden on you of having to educate me. So if there's stuff you think that I should read, or I can go, Google stuff, but I'm wide open. I want you to be successful. In fact, I won't be successful unless you're successful.
Wonderful, right? If we stopped right there, like that's how you separate, in my opinion, the real from people that are just putting stuff out in bookstores that are nice in theory. Like one, it's so refreshing. You and I are still getting to know one another. You didn't hesitate at all. You jump in. Role playing is not stupid. It's real life. And two, like if I was analyzing that, that's really hard unless I'm really trying to be intransigent to keep coming at you, because you've given me the validation I need. You've created space. And not only that, you've empowered me by now being able to, for me to give suggestions and an open ear. So sorry for putting you on the spot like that. But hopefully,
I love it. Thank you for putting me on the spot. And I think also with this kind of thing, it is really like one thing that we did that I found really fun with Second City is we were with a team of people at a tech company, and we got everyone to write down 2 sentences that describe the most offensive thing anyone ever said to them at work.
wow.
And like, you can't believe the thing, like it was really eye-opening. And then we would have someone pick up the piece of paper. We put all the pieces of paper in a hat. And then someone would play the role of the person who caused harm, and the other person would play the role of the person to whom it was said. And then there was an upstander, a person who was going to help intervene. And we got people just sort of playing with these scenarios. And it was so useful because this kind of thing happens. Like,
all the time.
Every single one of those things was shocking and you couldn't believe it happened. You also knew that and not only could you believe it did happen, you're also certain it's going to happen again. Something like it is going to happen again. And I think too often we default to silence in the face of these kinds of things because we don't know what to say. Can't believe, and we default to silence or defensiveness when we're the person who said the incredibly stupid thing or painful thing or harmful thing. And so using improv to learn how not to default to silence is so important, I think.
Well, and that's something that really brought your book Just Work to life for me in the sense that, so we have a practice that we call our workshops the Apprenticeship, because we just know nobody ever masters communication, right? An ode to kind of Hemingway. So what we do is we create a circle of attendees. And this is just one advanced exercise when we're trying to break up the normal improv, right? And, in the football world, there was this drill where somebody stood in the circle and anybody could come from any direction one at a time and kind of make contact with them. It's outlawed now for whatever, for many reasons. But so we take this with communication and we say, hey, think of, like you said, some of the most offensive things or the things that kind of get you on edge.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is, in the context of this exercise, somebody from the workshop is going to come up from any angle, say what they're going to say to you. You have to have a response. It has to be in a window of about 5 seconds, and then another person. Now, I know some people are like, oh my God, this is awful. And so we had somebody, and they were an educator, and they said, here's my issue. And tell me if you think that I did this well or not. I love your feedback, because this made your book come to life for me. He said, the big thing I have is parent-teacher conferences. These parents say the most unfathomable things to me.
Yeah.
And I said, well, let's game it out. So we give everybody cards, or we give them cues. It kind of gives them an idea of the personality or persona they can play. And one comes up and they might be like, hey man, it was a younger individual. Hey man, how old are you? 22? What do you know about my kid? You don't even have kids of your own. And he'd have a moment to so it keeps coming. And this individual just kind of, he smiled. Some people will smile when they get nervous. Yeah. So the whole activity kind of smiled. And I'm like, we're not getting under his skin, or he's not buying in. Yeah. We keep applying pressure. Eventually it's over. And Kimmy tears up. And I go, I feel bad as a facilitator but I'm like, hey, I'm sorry, if we push it too far, this was, and he's like, no, that's what I needed because that's what happens. And then what was like interesting about that is then a gentleman who was on highway patrol and other people were like, listen, man, you don't need to feel silly about that at all. You know what happens to me now that police officers are often vilified, and then somebody else is, let me tell you about my experience as a female coach. So you have this moment, right? That was a moment in terms of confronting bullying and everything like you talk about, but it's not really anchored with anything until he's had that emotion with it. Yeah. And then he's able to utilize it. Does that make sense? And then we do an after action review. We watch the video because he goes, well, why'd you tune it up like that? And I go, watch your face. And I go, guys, do not lie. This is more radical candor. I go, if you guys didn't know this gentleman right here, how many would look at his body language and say that he looked like he didn't give a shit? And people raised their hand because he had his hands in his pockets, was smirking, but really he was just fretting on the inside and didn't know how to interact, because that's hard. It's a skill, as you alluded to. So I'll open that up for your criticism, but I wanted to give you just thanks because that brought your book to life in a very real way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great exercise, and I think it also builds empathy. We all, I think, suffer from these repetitive stress injuries that
great way to put it,
that life throws at us. So, like one person saying, are you unattached or unaffiliated? These things that people have said to me. It's no big deal, the one thing, but it's like it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And that's why I think it is useful to know what's the nature of this person's 1,000 paper cuts versus that person's 1,000 paper cuts, and not to say, oh, your paper cuts are not painful, my paper cuts. We all have them. And to begin to build a little compassion for one another and for what we go through, I think is really important. The other thing that's really striking about that exercise is the extent to which we misinterpret each other's facial expressions and body language.
Right.
And there's increasingly there's evidence that shows that it's better if you want to give someone some feedback to call them on the phone than to have a Zoom call. Because of this inability that we have. I mean, there's two problems with a Zoom call. One is that we misinterpret each other's facial expressions. And two is that none of us are as good as we should be at turning off all our notifications. So there's distraction. But I think it's also true in person. People are not willing to say a phone call might be a better way to communicate than an in-person conversation. But I wonder sometimes if it might be, because there's perhaps more noise than signal in someone's smile. Like someone smirks because they're profoundly uncomfortable and they don't want to show it, Jason Rosoff, who I started Radical Candor with, has been accused of having resting bitch face. I don't see it, but he'll be sort of looking skeptical, but thinking, oh, what a great idea,
Yep, no, 100%.
And so it is really important that we are humble when we think we know what is going on with someone else, that we ask them, like, why are you folding your arms? Are you skeptical about what I'm saying? Instead of saying, stop being such a skeptical asshole,
Sure. I mean, I relate to that in the sense that, when we first started this podcast, in order to keep the bandwidth and audio quality high, we used to not do Zoom, right? Yeah. And obviously that takes away a tremendous context-rich medium in which you can connect. But it was scary because we live about an hour outside of Atlanta, and a power company was constantly doing work. And I said, well, I have to weigh here. Do I want to come across as unprofessional if our internet always cuts out no matter what we do? Yeah. Or do I need to take a short-term hit? Now, of course, the preference is what you and I are doing right now, being able to communicate over Zoom. And there's just so many wonderful constraints within the mediums that we use and the channels that connect us. And it's interesting to see, like, in some aspects that really helps, such as this conversation. In other, it's taken a while for it to help. Like you look at social media, which I don't demonize as much as everybody else, but that's content. Like you look at like an Instagram, which I initially got on because it was more context rich than Twitter. But eventually they all kind of become a cesspool of their own creation because they start shifting what they were, right? Whereas Instagram used to be able to put up a basic video, a little bit of context in the caption. Now it's like, you better know iMovie, you better have a full-time content creator. And then what happens is people just, I don't want to say normal people, that's not what I mean, but people that don't have those skill sets just detach from it. And it becomes now an echo chamber of people with very specific skill sets or points of view. And that takes away the harmony of us all coming closer. Do you see that at all? Does it ever make you wonder what social media of the future looks like so that we can, create, just better environments for us to communicate and deal with bias?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's social media,
I didn't throw you an easy one there. I'm sorry.
It'll be 30 years before I have anything truly intelligent to say. But I will say, Obama gave a talk recently at Stanford last week, I think, actually, and I'll send you a link. You should drop
Please.
it. It was really interesting about social media. I think after World War II, why do we have the Federal Communications Commission? I didn't know this but it was because Hitler made such good use of the radio. And we realized that we better have some rules around how we use this new broadcast medium. And I think I believe that we're gonna, I hesitate to say this because I know a lot of people will hate this, but our
audience gets it. Go ahead.
We're gonna have to regulate it. I think we're gonna have to regulate, there is a reason why. So I spent, when I was working at Google, I managed Blogger as well as YouTube. So a lot of social media stuff. And I was on part of what my team did was take down problematic content. And it was, it was hard to make the rules. It was even harder to enforce the rules. And people are endlessly, like you say, no porn, and then somebody takes a picture of himself in front of a shiny toaster that he's selling. And it gets past, you don't notice at first what he's really selling. And so, so there's like, people are endlessly creative in their ways to get around your rules. And so, I don't pretend.
It's tricky. Yeah, no, I appreciate your candor on that. Like, and what you said about that makes me think of, I remember hearing a story, and so I'm looking down to consult a note here so I get it accurate. There was something about the use of radio in Rwanda as well. It was an episode I listened. Yeah, do you remember hearing this?
Yeah. They compared, to bugs, and, they animalized.
Yeah, but then what they did is they said, all right, let's flip it. And this ties back into improv and the useful tools that you share in all your work, is they said, all right, well, if people are going to take to this to weaponize it, let's see what else we can do. And so they created this like Romeo and Juliet radio series in Rwanda. And they said, all right, people are going to conform to social norms, and they're going to do what people think is expected of them. And so basically they kind of adapted the story so that, you have these two feuding families, blah, 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 but they come together, right? We all know that's what happens in Romeo and Juliet. And of course, it's a tragedy as well. But all of a sudden, it got people on these competing, the Hutus and the Tutsis and everything. Like, it got them, I believe it was them, to come together a little bit more, or it got them to decrease the amount of killings because people from both sides of it were now listening and finding that common ground. Yes, I'm trying to remember where this was. I'll drop a link when it is, but they said when social norms change, it emboldens supporters. And that leads to dissenters to shrug their shoulders and start to go along with it. And that makes me think of what you talk about with bias. There's some people that have written books on bias that just kind of like wishy-washy, whatever. But when you have created something that's actionable and you can take it and you can role play it, and then people say, this isn't really what we thought it was. This isn't cheesy, wishy-washy leadership. I'll get on board. And if you can just get a few people on board, now everybody starts doing it. Now it's not just the Googles and the Intels and the this. Now it's a small mom and pop place down the road. Now it's, it's our company of 4 people who are remote, always trying to make sure that we talk about these things. Or even if I'm bringing up on a staff meeting, I say, hey guys, I've had a bad day. I might lose my shit a little, but I'm going to try to keep it in bounds. Let's play fairly here. Don't judge me, please, because I have no outlet and it's a small company. But at the same time, I'm going to try to not go off. And we've got to operationalize it within, that gray area too a little bit. So anyway, I hope that everybody looks at whatever medium they're looking at and says, this can be flipped for a positive as well. So
Yeah, I love that. I love that story about the radio in Rwanda. I think right now there's this notion that all you have to do is flood the zone with shit, and then it takes us all down the toilet. And I think you can also flood the zone with great stuff, and I think we got to start flooding the zone with greatness to wash away all that the other junk. And I think there's a place and time to deplatform.
Right. No, 100%. Well, I have two more questions to honor your time. So in your book, and this one comes from a gentleman in Wales named Seb, and Seb says, Kim mentions how checks and balances can be used to avoid injustice at work, quoting research that suggests the more power a person has, the more likely their decision-making is to be flawed by bias. He goes on to then say, when you mentioned the use of diverse panel and committee to make decisions, which I'll let you elaborate on, he said, I would be interested in how to make use of these checks and balances in a way to avoid it becoming overly bureaucratic and a slow process. For example, how do you do this effectively in a small startup, which needs to make decisions quickly? So if anything's not clear there, I'll try to, but I thought that was an excellent question, and I wanted to bring in somebody internationally as well. And if I can clarify anything, let me know. I want to set you up for success.
The thing about checks and balances is it's not all about like some ginormous process. The thing is, if I start a company, and I learned this the hard way, when I was the co-founder and CEO of a company I started, I believed if I were in charge, everything would be great, and the problem, of course, was that I didn't always do the right thing. And because I had sole control, really, of that company, I definitely had the voting shares and all the things that entrepreneurs always do to try to make sure they're in control. Then when things went wrong and people didn't feel safe coming to, and I assumed everybody's going to feel safe coming to me, but, it turned out they didn't. There was nowhere for them to go. And so if I had gone into this setting up my governance structure not to make sure that I was in control, but to make sure that there were checks and balances on my power, then I actually would have been more successful. So I was talking to Alan Eustace, who's an investor here in Silicon Valley and an early engineering leader at Google, and he said, I am the chair of the board of several companies, and where's the check on my power? Yeah. And he actually went to those companies and made sure there's an ombudsperson who could check his power. And that's what you want to do. It's not about setting up some huge process, but I do think if you are hiring someone, even if you're the sole proprietor, you're going to hire your first employee, you don't want to make that decision alone. You want to find someone who's willing to interview that person and offer you another perspective, because it turns out that in highly functioning teams make better decisions than individuals. I mean, of course, in a dysfunctional team, then it makes but let's assume that you're creating a functional team. Yeah.
Well, and I like that answer, because it's something we try to even do with this podcast, and I hope we don't fail at it too often, but I always try to tell guests, hey, there's sometimes where I'm just going to play devil's advocate. I might even like what you're saying, but I'm going to be like, nah, I'm calling BS. How would you address that? And that's because we want dialogues that are functional as well, right? Like that always drove me nuts about podcasts, where I'd hear somebody very interesting on it, but then it was almost this supplication on behalf of the interviewer. It's like, yes, dude, we know they're great. We know their book's amazing, but kind of push back, have some fun, and all that. So I appreciate you saying we have to have teams. We have to have people that are willing to push. And it's not just diversity for diversity's sake. It's like, just explore different angles, you know? And so anything else you want to touch on there before I hit you with one of our final questions?
You want to create the obligation to dissent around you. And that's not the permission to dissent, but the obligation. You want the people around you to feel like, even if they think they might agree, to find a reason to look for holes. Like you'd rather your friends do that than the big mean world.
So, and that's the point, right? Somebody's going to do it.
Yeah.
And that is something that we try to tell coaches. It's like, yo, come get evaluated, come do this. And coaches, we use that in leadership synonymously, just they both mean to guide. Come get evaluated, and not from people that say we're not the experts at communication, but we're saying that you need somebody to tell you you're maybe not coming across the right way. And I remember when coaches would say, well, we do this with our staff all the time. And you're like, all right, well, your staff isn't always going to tell you what's up, and that goes into creating that. Or, yeah, well, we bring people into our environment. Right. But like if you bring an outside consultant into your environment,
Yeah, and you're paying them.
right, that's still a power dynamic, right? And it's like we have this tremendous, and then everybody wants to hide behind, well, I don't have the time and I don't have the money. And it's like, well, then you don't have the desire to lead, do you?
Yeah.
You don't.
Yeah.
You know? So the other thing I want to ask you, okay, this one comes from Allie Kirshner. She's our director of creative strategy. And Allie had to do something a few years ago that was akin to what you did in Just Work, be it in a different context, right? She came out as a lesbian, and that took a lot of courage. And she had to worry about, okay, I'm going to coach in this community. How's my family gonna, like, just all the things that comes with, right? Well, you in Just Work talk about being in an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
And you put that into a book. And on my end, I talk about my household story. I know there's all these things that come up of, should I do it, right? There's the vulnerability side. There's the, is it going to be seen as self-aggrandizing or tension side? But really, you're just trying to no, this contextualizes everything. Can you talk to me about that decision, either from the context of why you did it, what the thought process was like, so that if somebody listening has this thing in them, whatever it is, because like you said, it's not a competition, but they want to get it out and not be, perceived the wrong ways as much as they can control that. What was that thought process like for you?
I think part of it is when I write the first draft of a book, I'm just writing as though I'm writing in my journal. So there wasn't much. I just was like rooting around in my head to try to make sense of my own experience. And then I wind up sharing the draft with a lot of different people. Because the second hardest thing about writing a book is getting inside your own head. And the very hardest thing is getting back out. And that's where other people really are helpful. And there were two people who read that chapter and had very different points of view. One was my father, who was like, absolutely, you should never say that. Take that out, delete that. And I understood where he was coming from. And there was part of me that wanted to take it out. And then there was someone else who read it who said, wow, this is going to help a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it was her voice that was even louder than my father's voice, who just wanted me to protect myself. And I think the thing about that relationship, it wasn't physically abusive, but it was psychologically abusive. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know why it took me that long to realize that I was in a psychologically abusive relationship, because it's so obvious in retrospect. But I think that is true for a lot of us find ourselves in these relationships that are just bad for us.
Yeah, the key thing you said there is, right, retrospect, hindsight's 2020. But when those emotions are tied up, it has a way of bringing about tremendous bias and blindfolds and all these pieces, right? Which is why, like you said, we have to practice it. I'm sorry, I interrupted. I wanted to keep, okay. Yeah, and listen, I think that, like I said, tremendous admiration for the fact that you're bringing this stuff out here in a real way. I'll admit, probably me 5 years ago would have thought that this was just like 5 other leadership books that I have on the shelf that tell you what to be, just be this magnanimous leader who, the world can be this bright, shiny place, and then you just realize, no, this is a completely different tone. And this individual has been there, done that, and written about it in a very tactical way that you can put to use. And to a point, if you don't think you can, you're making excuses. So I want to thank you for that. And then I want to give you the floor for any last minute kind of pieces there. And of course, we're going to link her book, Radical Candor and Just Work. You can get them. They're available worldwide. Make sure you guys check the show notes. But Kim, you get the last word.
Well, first of all, just thank you. I loved writing both books, and I really tried to write both books more like a book of short stories. I hate management books myself, truthfully, most of them. I mean, there's some that I really love, but I think there's so much human drama that is the essence of management, actually. And to try to put the negative parts of that drama down and really build better relationships, that's what's gonna give work meaning, I think, for me anyway, and for a lot of other people. So I hope both books help and also are fun to read.
No question. And we'd love to get out and experience some of what you do at Second City. And obviously it's a standing invite. Anytime you want to come experience what we do, I know you have a jam-packed schedule. You run the world in many different ways, but it's an open invite, and it's just a pleasure talking to you. So thank you again.
Great talking to you. Thank you.
All right, guys. Until next time, Brett Bartholomew with Kim Scott. Talk to you soon.